Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Florence Williams presenting Heartbreak, a personal and scientific journey. She'll be joined in conversation by Claire Dederer. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-growing digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our 2022 events calendar is in full swing, and it appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to purchase a copy of the book. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, just go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption live transcript button on your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past 2 years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Florence Williams is an author, journalist, and podcaster. You may be familiar with her work, which has appeared in Outside Magazine, The New York Times, National Geographic, and Slate, among many others. Her books include The Nature Fix and Breasts, A Natural and Unnatural History, which won the LA Times Book Prize in Science and Technology. She's been recognized by the National Magazine Awards, the American Society of Journalists and Authors, and the John Hersey Prize at Yale. Tonight, she'll be talking with Claire Dederer, an essayist and memoirist. She's the author of 2 critically acclaimed books, Love and Trouble and Poser. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, Vogue, and the Paris Review, which published her thought-provoking essay, What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men? What if a broken heart is more than a metaphor? In her memoir, Heartbreak, A Personal and Scientific Journey, Florence Williams uses her own heartbreak, the end of her 25-year marriage, as a catalyst for exploring what happens down to the cellular level when we experience loss. From conventional wisdom to cutting-edge science and everything in between, Heartbreak is a smart and sensitive look at love and loneliness. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly says it's a show-stopping, offbeat story about the science of heartbreak and a courageous whirlwind tale of healing and self-discovery. And Outside Magazine has named it the February pick for their Outside Book Club. And so now I am pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. Florence and Claire, the digital podium is yours.
Hi, everyone. Florence here. Thank you so much for turning out tonight. I am a huge fan of the Harvard Bookstore, one of my absolute favorite bookstores. And so grateful to both the Claires, Claire at Harvard Bookstore and Claire Dederer, who will be in conversation with me tonight. They've asked me to start by reading a short passage. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll jump into our conversation. The passage I'm going to read is about midway through the book. Really, the heart of the book is a river trip that I take. That's a kind of a 30-day wilderness trip in this effort to heal from heartbreak. And about halfway through the trip, I am approaching the solo phase of the journey and starting to kind of think about what I'm hoping to get out of it. So that's what I'm going to read from. At first, I'd resisted thinking of my river journey in the context of a rite or quest, because those terms have too easily been appropriated by Castaneda-following groupies and seekers. I wasn't going to be smudging myself with sage or going hungry in hopes of seeing visions. But then I gave a talk at a high school in California, and I met a teacher named Julie Barnes. Barnes runs Marin Academy's outdoor program, which includes a 3-day wilderness solo for seniors. She told me how powerful the experience is for kids who are about to leave home for the first time. It strips away their usual distractions and supports and homes in on what they want to claim in their lives as they go through this transition, she said. Who do they want to be as they step across this threshold and then step back into the world? She said kids at this age are wired for deep challenges that match their energy. It's how their brains mature and learn. Without some sanctioned hardships, they risk becoming overly infantilized, delaying growing up and assuming responsibility for themselves and their communities, or they may take inappropriate, truly dangerous risks instead. Women my age, too, are wired for transition. The writer and ethnographer Howard Norman once told me about interviewing an Inuit woman who laid out her life story. He said to her, "I see everything but the years from when you were 50 to 54. "Oh, I have no words for those years," she replied. "Why not?" "In those years," she told him, "I was a polar bear." These are our polar bear years. Everything about us is changing physically, hormonally, emotionally. Our shifting roles in culture, work, and family upend our identities, even without divorce. I told Barnes about my own reluctant transition and my desire to mark it, recover from it, figure out what the hell comes next. She convinced me of the importance of setting clear intentions for my solo, and I found myself reviewing them during the quiet stretches on Desolation Canyon. What did I really want to do out here? I wanted, of course, to be fixed, to transform into a woman ready to take on the rest of her life, to launch my boat as a means of launching myself into a better future. But Julie Barnes had warned me that those expectations were naive and impatient. It was more realistic to solidify the goodbyes. I wanted, like Barnes's school kids, to individuate. In my case, away from my moribund, fossilized identity in a couple. To do that, I wanted to access my bravery. I wanted to transmute my fear into something else, something like what I had glimpsed paddling through Disaster Falls and Split Mountain: momentum, power, agency. I wanted to learn how to take care of myself and learn how to be alone. I wanted to cultivate beauty and experience awe. I wanted finally to say goodbye to my marriage. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. I just first want to say congratulations. The book is just wonderful. And I gobbled it up and was so blown away by it. So just brava. And I wanted to say welcome to everyone. And I see Florence and I both have some dear friends who are here. So thank you for coming. I will preface this conversation by saying that last time Florence and I have known each other a long time, or old friends. And last time we were physically in the same place, we were both still in long marriages, and now we're both divorced or in the process of divorcing. So this book had a lot of urgency for me and a lot of affirmation of feelings, and just I really appreciated it. So thank you. And just a couple housekeeping points of order. Florence and I will talk until about 7:45 or 4:45 Seattle time. And then I'll take questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. I'm not going to monitor the chat. So you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A spot where you can enter your questions. And you can do that anytime over the next half hour or so. First question is, how did you come to write about this particular subject? Specifically, how did you decide on the more general topic of heartbreak rather than divorce, or, rather than divorce?
Lots of books out there about divorce. A lot of them are sort of how-to-y. I mean, the way that I've kind of pursued my journalism career lately, especially through my books, and this is my third book, is that I have some kind of relatively burning question that is driving my own curiosity, that I feel like could make a good, topic to investigate. This is the first one that I felt like my survival sort of depended on that investigation. What happened is that I'd, been in this 25-year marriage, but really a 32-year relationship. I met the man who would be my husband when I was 18, literally the first day of college. So I was a baby, and had never been alone. I had never been heartbroken. I knew very little about men and very little about relationships, despite having been in one. But mostly what I noticed right away, and the decision to split was not totally mutual, as they often are not. It was more his decision. And I felt like my body kind of freaked out. I felt it. I felt the social pain, the pain of divorce, the emotional pain, I felt it register inside my body. And literally my cells and my immune cells started changing, and I was getting sick, and I ended up in the ER. And so all these questions, like, why is this happening? What is going on? I've never experienced this kind of emotional pain, despite having lost my mother, by the way, when in my 20s. To lose your sort of primary attachment figure is, for me anyway, it was a whole different sort of order of magnitude of freak out. I was terrified. And so that's what launched the journey. It was like, what is going on, and how the hell can I get better? Because I need to get better. So, reporter hat on and pen and notebook out. It was part of my survival strategy.
Well, it benefits all of us. I wanted to start with those physical manifestations of heartbreak. And I wonder if you could talk about some of them, maybe starting with the phenomenon, and I'm sure I'll say this wrong, but Takotsubo cardiomyopathy.
Yes.
Super interesting.
So fortunately, that's not one that I had, but it's not, but people do. It's a kind of heart failure that looks very different from your sort of typical heart attack, where there's a blockage of an artery. In this case, there's so much adrenaline, so much sort of stress hormone flooding the receptors on the heart, that the left ventricle of the heart balloons out and becomes unable to sort of efficiently pump blood. So, people have known for a long time, epidemiologists have known for hundreds of years by looking at gravestones in churches, that husbands and wives often die, sometimes days or months apart. Sometimes people will drop dead, after the death of even a pet. There are documented cases in the literature of sports fans having this kind of heart failure when their teams lose the World Cup. So, we think of heartbreak as being a metaphor, but sometimes it's not. I think it was William Farr in the 18th century had this great quote that the tragedies of life are largely arterial.
That's so good.
That we do feel these tragedies inside our blood and inside our veins.
Can you talk more about physical manifestations you had personally?
Yeah, so for me, right away, I kind of felt like my stomach moved, shifted to a different place in my body. I felt like there was a sort of dramatic moment in the breakup where it became clear that my life was going to look really different. And that's when I felt like my stomach sort of shifted, and my chest tightened, and I felt like I wasn't able to take deep breaths for actually a really long time. I wasn't able to sleep. I lost a ton of weight. I lost like 20 pounds I didn't want to lose, even though I was trying to eat. And eventually I had really high blood sugar, and I ended up in the ER with high blood sugar and a type 1 diabetes diagnosis, which is an autoimmune disease. It's usually diagnosed in children. But I got diagnosed, at age 50. And a Stanford researcher I spoke to said he thinks that sometimes these autoimmune diseases and type 1 diabetes can be emotionally triggered. Of course, it's really it's really impossible to tell a direct cause and effect, with one individual. But the emotional triggers really do affect your immune system and your immune cells. And that's part of what we ended up really investigating in this book.
Well, you did talk to one researcher who said there is an inflammation story related to divorce as well, which is a great line.
That was a great line. And I was like, I need to hear that story and I need to tell that story because I don't think it's been told.
Yeah. So can you just kind of outline that just a little bit for people?
Yes. Yeah. So I met this great immunogeneticist at UCLA named Stephen Cole. And for decades, he's been studying loneliness and why it is that lonely people die earlier. Why is it that they progress faster to metastatic cancer? Why is it that they have higher rates of dementia and Alzheimer's? I mean, we've known these epidemiological results for a long time, but we didn't really know why. And so what he's been doing is actually looking at transcription factors in people's genomes, find out why certain genes are being turned on and off, especially genes being turned on for inflammation.
Right.
And because the immune system can't do everything, it turns off genes that do things like fight viruses, which, is a very interesting kind of question to be looking at the start of the pandemic.
Right, exactly. I was going to say this has a much, a really broad application right now.
Right. And so I was really interested to know why that is. Like, why is our body responding in this way that seems singularly unhelpful at a time when we're going through this emotional disaster? Now we also have to go through this physical crisis. It just seemed cosmically unfair.
And you had your own genes studied over the course of the book, correct? Can you talk about that experience?
Yeah. So when I was, talking to Stephen Cole, I told him, I've just been divorced. I've just been diagnosed with diabetes. And he said, well, why don't you come into the lab, give me some of your blood. We'll see if you have the cells of a lonely person. And then you can try to, do all these science-backed things that are supposed to make you feel better, and we'll check your blood again. So that seemed like an irresistible invitation. Yeah. And that's what we did. And in fact, spoiler alert. I mean,
I was like, spoilies. Yeah.
I don't know how much we want to say, but yeah, my blood looked pretty bad. My transcription factors did not look so great.
It was pretty stunning to see how you could read it on your blood. That was fascinating and unexpected for me. When I was reading the book, I kept thinking of this poem that's always stuck in my head from the 19th century by some guy named Charles Kingsley. And it has this line in it: men must work and women must weep. And I was really interested in the differences in heartache between the two genders and wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too. We know that men and women do seem to respond somewhat differently to heartache, although men certainly feel plenty of it also. But one psychologist I talked to said that women take this kind of, I guess, especially rejection, romantic rejection very, very seriously because we're so relational, because at least in our modern culture, our roles as wives and as mothers are so central to our lives. And men take blows to their social status and their professional status harder in general. We also know that after rejection, men and women behave differently. Both tend to lose some impulse control and, kind of drink too much and, act out and get upset and get dramatic. But the men tend to more often turn violent, and they're victims of course, the women. So this is a whole area of study. The sort of science of ostracization or science of rejection is now getting a lot more traction because of things like mass shootings, unfortunately, where we know a lot of the perpetrators are somewhat outcasts. And so it all goes back to, our deep human need for belonging and how things can kind of fall apart and spiral out of control pretty fast when you feel like you've been kicked out.
Right. Like we have this very facile word for that, which is incel, right? That there's this culture of involuntary celibate men who become violent. And that's sort of an accepted idea, but there's all this heartbreaking science underlying it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I mean, the book focuses sort of, one of the things that's so brilliant about the book is, you're weaving in your personal story, you're weaving in the science, you're weaving in social science and some economics, and talking about kind of what it's like culturally, socially for a woman to be divorced or to be ending a marriage. And I wondered if you could talk about economic and social losses a woman experiences when she leaves her marriage.
Yes, either when she leaves or is left.
When her marriage is over.
The financial consequences for her are much more likely to be dire. So divorced women are twice as likely to live in poverty as divorced men. They are less likely to walk away with assets, to the same level that their spouse does. They're less likely to have health insurance. Of course, many of them have worked part-time and put their career second. So, fewer assets, all that stuff. I personally had seen this, and I had seen sort of generations of it. And so I felt in some ways like I was holding sort of generational resentment from this. I mean, I saw it happen to my mother.
Yeah.
And so I think that was part of what was adding to my sort of general, rage, I guess, but also freak out. Like I was really worried about my future. I was really like, how is this going to work? How am I going to have health insurance? It's like, just a lot of anxiety piling on about growing old alone as a single woman and being aware of a lot of these statistics, both personally and just sociologically.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really very little understood about divorce is actually how rare it is among educated, educated middle-class people. And I wonder if you read this essay by Anne Helen Peterson called Blue Marriage and the Terror of Divorce.
Yeah.
It's an amazing essay. I don't know if Claire can put it up in the chat, but it's Anne Helen Peterson, Blue Marriage and the Terror of Divorce. And I just wanted a couple things she wrote chimed with some stuff you wrote about. So I just wanted, people might not know this. She says, people are waiting longer to get married, having fewer kids, and then staying married longer, presumably because they had more time to think through whether or not they wanted the marriage. If this sounds true to you and true of the people who surround you, then chances are high that you're a middle-class college-educated person who is largely surrounded by other middle-class college-educated people. And those people are much, much less likely to actually divorce. So now I'm jumping into Florence's book. You write, survey data from my DC neighborhood shows that 90% of the housing stock belongs to married couples. Although my husband had argued that half of marriages end in divorce and therefore stop overreacting, I learned that among post-college educated women who married in the 1990s, that's us, divorce rates are at about 14%. So can you talk about that, the way that sort of we have this idea that half of marriages end in divorce, and yet we don't see it around us and in our communities if we are this woman?
Yeah, and we are children of divorce. So I think, in 1980, divorce rates really were 50%, but they've more than halved. The rates have, dropped more than by half. And so it is a very lonely kind of making experience. None of my close friends had gone through this. All of my close friends were long married, 20 plus year marriages. And I felt like they were sort of freaking out on my behalf. They were like, what are you going to do? I was like, oh, I need some new friends. I need to.
Here's my solution, new friends. Yeah.
I mean, I love my old friends, but I also felt like I need some role models. Like other than just, my mother, which, as much as I love her, had a really tough go of it in the 70s being a single mom.
Did you feel any sense of stigma about getting a divorce, or, any
Yeah,
shame?
definitely. I think shame and stigma are a huge part of this. And I worried about my children on behalf of this too, because they didn't have a lot of friends who were going through this. Unlike when we were kids, when it seems like, all of our friends came from divorce.
Right, exactly.
My kids did not have that experience. And so, I was concerned for them as well.
Did that stigma how did that play out, that sense of shame or stigma, in terms of writing this book? Did you feel, I know that I've written about very kind of shameful things, and sometimes it can be a fuel, because the book that you would have wanted to have, and you want to give that book to either your past self or to someone else going through that experience. Or did it make it harder?
Good question. I think there was definitely an element of fuel to it. And I'm reminded of one of the studies that I point to in the book, talking about how rejection can actually fuel creativity. Because if you're the sort of person who thinks that maybe you are already a little bit unique, if you have sort of like, and I think a lot of journalists and writers have this, we feel like we're already sort of outsiders, looking in as we go through our days. And if we've been sort of rejected, sometimes what happens is it can drive people to say, I knew it. I knew I was different, and I'm going to prove, how much I can actually own this, feeling of nonconformity. Like, I'm going to sort of turn this into my new identity in some ways. And it can kind of fuel that. It can fuel that process. And I think it can be a little bit energizing. I know for me, I kind of felt like I want to take this terrible experience and, try to turn it into something useful, try to learn something from it. I wanted so badly for it to be a growth experience and an experience of transformation, that I think that did fuel the writing, actually.
Yeah. And I feel like that's part of the story here. I was just looking at my paper because I was just thinking about nonconformity. You said about halfway through the book, the book is really structured in many ways like a memoir. We have sort of Florence one way at the beginning, and then the book follows her transformation to become a slightly different Florence. So about halfway through the book, this changing Florence says, now that I was single in middle age and therefore officially nonconformist, I knew I should try to reframe my circumstances as having certain advantages. I loved the clinicalness of that. Like, how am I going to turn this to my advantage? So there's this idea of creativity that comes with being an outlier, this like rejection, outlier, nonconformity. These are different angles on the same experience, right?
Yeah.
And what other advantages? What were the things that you found as you emerged from conformity? I mean, not that you had a very interesting life, but into this new nonconformity.
I think for me, it became this journey of self-discovery, because I had been with my ex since I was 18. I really didn't know who I was outside of the context of that marriage. We all, when we're in any kind of relationship, even a good relationship, you're co-creating kind of a new unit. Mm-hmm. And there are necessarily parts of yourself that you're going to sort of subsume. And perhaps, if you're younger, you're more likely to do that. I don't know. And if you're a woman, perhaps you're more likely to do that. So all of a sudden, it was kind of like this light bulb of like, oh, who the hell am I? This could be interesting, actually. And there was some kind of mental shift that happened, I think, where I was like actually curious about that and curious about that person, and kind of excited by it. I had opportunities to do various sorts of adventuring in the book, sexual and otherwise, that completely just surprised me. And it wasn't all bad. I mean, it was like, okay, I'm going to feel my edges and know who I am. And you can't really do that, I think, unless sometimes you're sort of torn down to the studs a little bit. And Claire, can I turn this question on you? Because I'm curious to know, as a long married person, newly not married, if you're having similar experiences.
Well, I was thinking about when we had a different, my husband and I, we had sort of a mutual taking apart of our marriage. And one of the things that I was shocked in therapy to discover was preoccupying me was the loss of privilege. We think about all these different kinds of privileges we accrue over our lives. And for me, I hadn't realized how much privilege, financial, societal, all these things inhered in marriage itself, and more specifically in my role as a wife. There's certain, and the privilege I think had to do with like an identity, like you were just saying, who am I? And I think that I had this like, oh, well, I'm a wife. And there was a way in which I sort of didn't have to think about that. And, of course, a mother as well. But taking away the wife piece, that felt like, Wile E. Coyote out over the canyon, with my feet scrambling. And I hadn't realized how much that sort of role made me safe. And so letting go of that was really scary to me. So to your question, what have I found on the other side of that? I mean, just the dizziness of being able to do what I want and actually being aware of what I want after sort of subsuming or truncating or bending for so long, right? Like just the freedom of that it sounds really banal or like the most obvious answer, but it is very, very, very strange to just do what you want.
The scaffolding is gone and you're sort of free falling, It's very destabilizing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, part of, especially initially, what felt so imperiling in some ways. And
well,
why?
It's interesting that you were so drawn to boats, and I'm now living on my dad's houseboat. And there's like this sense of wanting to be buoyant or to be held up. Like I definitely have had some sort of metaphorical thoughts about that. I wondered if you could talk, like, to me, well, actually, let's turn in this direction since we're sort of touching on leaving your marriage. This kind of subterranean theme of the book that I really related to and was fascinated by had to do with with a kind of numbness or shut-offness that can come in a very long marriage, which can kind of relate to what we were just talking about being in a role or sort of being held by a scaffolding. And one friend of yours in the book said that you also had participated in the quote, marital death march. The book and the divorce is a kind of waking up from numbness in a way. And so is there a way, like, what's the role of heartbreak in that? Can you think of heartbreak as signaling something positive, like the potential for feeling? And you write about this a little bit in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a major theme of the book, actually.
Yeah.
I think it was Susan Sontag has a quote that's something like, marriage is an institution dedicated to the numbing of feeling.
Yes, I underline.
Now, clearly she was not a happily married person. And that's not, of course, always the case. But, if you think about it, I mean, you're living with this person 24/7. There are so many small slights and hurt feelings and missed connections. Like, in order to survive, you do kind of numb to a certain extent. And you also want to have a certain amount of amnesia, right? About all the things that drive you crazy about this person. So, when that's gone, I think, at some point I became aware of how numb I had been, partly because I had this devastating feeling of loss and grief and pain. It was like I had never felt that kind of emotion before. But eventually, I also noticed that I was occasionally experiencing more joy and more vitality and more awe and more beauty. And I became kind of able to, I think, see how those worked in complement. That if you feel more alive, you're going to feel more pain, but you're also going to feel the highs. And that feeling more alive was so much better than feeling numb. It was
well, I think that was one of the reasons it was such an interesting read, because at the beginning, you do a really good job. Like, one of the things that's really difficult about writing a book length work about a personal experience is that you, Florence, as the author, know things now that your character didn't know at the beginning of the book, right? And so you have to make her a little bit of a dummy in order for her to have room to grow. And I think that one thing that, yeah, I think that, yeah, right, or show how she was a little bit of a dummy. And I think one thing that was interesting as a reader was the character, the narrator, clinging so tightly to this marriage at the beginning, but the reader getting these clues in the text that, like, oh, maybe the marriage wasn't ever, wasn't as good a marriage as she thought it was. I'm not going to say it wasn't a good marriage, but wasn't the sort of idealized marriage that she had in her brain. And so her discovery that maybe she could have more by being alone was one of the joys of the book. And that's more of a comment than a question. But yeah, it was really pleasurable to read. You write about we won't go heavily into the sexual part of the book, but you write so beautifully in this very fleeting passage. You say, something I hadn't felt in a long time was rising. It was part defiance, part survival instinct, part arousal. These were the feelings of youth, and I hadn't felt any of them for a long time. So obviously this is of interest of me because I wrote a whole book about exactly this 3 sentences you just mentioned. Can you talk about the meeting again of the young self?
Yeah, I think it's natural when a relationship ends to go back to who you were before the relationship, because that's the last person you knew.
Yeah.
That's sort of, not a part of this marriage. And for me, that person was 17 and 18 years old. And she was definitely, a dummy in a lot of ways. But I also had a certain fondness for her,
Yeah.
She was a teenager with a lot of, I think, adventuring and interest in adventuring, wilderness adventuring, intellectual adventuring, sexual adventuring. And to go back to that was really scary after 35 years. But also so interesting, like astoundingly interesting. Like, I just was blown away by, how my body was feeling things that it hadn't felt in a long time, at that intensity. And it was just one of those examples of, like, the doors getting blown off where you sort of feel more alive and, but also really, really decentered at the same time.
Yeah. I was wondering, so you talk about various sort of modalities you use to deal with your, whatever we decide to call it, heartbreak or trauma or the experience you'd gone through. So can you just kind of run down some of them for us? EMDR, wilderness, psychedelics, how did you come to each of these?
Yeah, I think you pretty much named the big ones. I was looking for things that had some, scientific backing behind them. And I was also looking to debunk these sort of things that you hear about curing heartbreak that don't have any science behind them.
Yeah.
So an example of that is, often you hear this sort of pablum about how if you've just left a long marriage, you need time to learn to love yourself before you jump into another relationship, or you need to heal first. And I was like, okay, that makes a lot of sense, but where's the science? Like, is there, and I think I was inclined to look for the science because I was a little bit, reluctant to heed that advice. And in fact, I found a scientific study showing that if you rebound after a breakup, you actually do better, or, at least on average, not everybody. But you can have more self-confidence, you can have higher self-esteem, you can feel more separation from the person that you've split from. And so that, I thought that was really interesting. Like, there's actually science promoting the rebound concept. But right. I think, the caveat there is if you're feeling scared, and your nervous system is on edge, you have to be careful. Like, you don't you have to, it should be with someone you trust and feel safe with, because a feeling of safety is really critical at that moment in the heartbreak.
Well, there's this wonderful way that your sister-in-law or ex-sister-in-law, Lisa, who really is just who I know too, and who is really just this wonderful person, she kind of parades through the book, dispensing wisdom. And, there's this way she's just, you're latching when you're in that moment of that rebound, there's that way, you've been starved and suddenly everything looks like it's delicious, but maybe it's not. So there's that whole section of the book was so fantastic.
She had so many perfect nuggets of wisdom for me. She couldn't believe that I had never experienced, the highs and lows of dating. I had never dated. And she was like, Florence, you're such a weirdo. Like, we all go through this in our 20s and 30s and you know nothing. You are totally naive. And she's like, I'm so sorry that you have to go through this now, but
you do. Yeah. I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A in a second, but I feel like I can't lose the chance to talk about a couple of crafty memoir things, because this is
good. Yes.
Yeah. So more than all your books, you've appeared as a character and you're really masterful at presenting the self, engaging with knowledge and having her own stakes. But this book is at a different level in terms of personal storytelling. And the first question I wanted to ask, when you write something really personal, people will always ask, did your children read the book, or did your parents read the book, and what did they think? And I'm not going to ask you that because I don't think it's really the point, and I don't think it's my business. But I am going to ask you a question that comes up a lot with my students, which is, how did you manage your fear about that as you were writing? This is something that really troubles memoir students I'm working with. When these people who are intimate with you come up in your mind, how, and also writing about real people, how did you manage both these close readers writing about something so intimate and real people you were describing?
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is it haunted me a lot. It was something I thought about a lot. I actually decided that I would have the important people in the book read either the whole book or the sections of the book that they were in.
Yeah.
I wanted them to be able to provide some feedback. So I did ask my children to read the sections that they were in. I discouraged them from reading other sections, which really wasn't that big of an ask because they've never read any of my other books.
Exactly, because they're good. Yeah.
And then I actually also had my therapist read it. And I was like, am I going to damage anyone in this book, through this book? And
yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. And then I actually had another professional mediator type person read it. And we had some interesting, hard conversations with my ex, after he read the book. And they were mediated conversations, and he ended up in a place that actually was, somewhat supportive, not necessarily thrilled about my taking this out into the world, but he understood why I needed to write this book. And that was huge for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I think it's one of the hardest things about writing about real people. It's hard.
Right. And it's slightly different in personal writing than it is in reported writing. I wonder, so do you think it's fair to say that one thing I always try to think about is this idea that you should write it down. And there's a lot of steps between you and publication. So write down what you want to say, try to be fair, try not to, psychoanalyze anyone on the page, which is not a great look. But just know that there's all kinds of steps you can take between finishing the book and publishing it, where you can get that kind of feedback from people, in your case, your therapist, or from subjects in the book, and it can be mitigated later, but first get it down. Do you think that's fair to say?
Well, I think that there are pitfalls with that approach, because I think that sometimes we can become so enthralled, by our own writing and attached to what we've actually just now put on the page. So I think for me, I write slowly anyway.
Mhm.
And I want my first drafts. I mean, they're nowhere near done, but I put a lot of thought into even the first drafts. And so there are sort of breaks for me. There are breaks going on, I think, the whole time. But I also felt there was a part of me that was like, this is still my story. And it's important to me that I feel like I'm not putting too many breaks on it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's interesting. That's a whole other issue, the writing style thing. Like I'm a thrower outer, and it sounds like you tend to keep things.
And then you can rip it up and not feel bad about it.
Yeah, but that's me. And I understand not everybody operates that way. But I think those are all helpful things for people to think about, finding outside readers and kind of knowing that it's not going to go straight from what you set down on the page to being in, between two covers, that there's different approaches to mitigating it. Another question about craft before I open up to audience questions. Did you write you were living this as you wrote it. Is that correct? Were you still kind of having these experiences as you wrote it?
Yes, but there was a lot of revision that happened when I was like many years beyond it too. So I did start reporting it right away. The research and the reporting were part of my sort of, trying to heal too. And I was dying to go out and talk to, scientists and to go visit the labs. And the scientists were so great, because they would also say, oh, I've had a heartbreak too. Let me tell you about mine. And it was really validating. And, they ended up being, great characters because of that.
Yeah.
But a lot of those early chapters that I wrote fast or early in the process, I had to go back and totally rewrite with the perspective of 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and sort of an idea of where you wanted the book to be pointing that you came to after having lived it, or?
Yeah, and also just more perspective. I mean, I felt like some of those chapters that were written early in the process were still too raw. And they just needed more distance, and they needed more humor, and they needed a bunch of other stuff that came later.
Yeah.
And I was grateful actually that I had many years to work on this book, because if I had, tried to, get it out there during the first or second year after the heartbreak, or during, of the heartbreak, it would have been too soon, I think.
Right. It's that paradox of, the experience is fueling you to write what you're writing, but the writing itself isn't a cathartic act. You're not finding your healing through the writing. You're trying to turn it into something someone would want to read.
Right. And then the writing's no good. So
right. If it's only for healing, it's no good, right? You have to, the catharsis part can be very unappealing on the page. Exactly. I'm going to open this up we have quite a few questions to the Q&A. Somebody says, what do you wish people said to you during your darkest point of heartbreak?
It was so helpful when people said to me, oh, I've been there. I've been there, because it was such a lonely making experience. The people who were most helpful to me were also the ones who just let me talk and talk and vent and listen. I feel like you sort of find out who your friends are. But yeah, I think just being there, just the friends who were there and listening, and sometimes saying, yeah, I get it. That's it. That was helpful.
Yeah, there's definitely this experience of people who just, I actually have some compassion for it. There's people who just can't show up for it. They just can't.
Yeah.
And that's fine. It's, I guess helping someone through a divorce is not for everyone, and that's okay. Mark says, speaking of children of divorce, I'm wondering what research has been done on the effect of heartbreak on children of divorce.
Well, there's been quite a lot on children of divorce. I don't know if looking at heartbreak, as opposed to, economic fallout and conflict in their parents. We know that if the parents have high conflict, that's worse for the kids. We know so much more now about how to do a good divorce. Mm-hmm. And I think it is possible actually to do a good divorce. I think it's possible that children can come out of this with, in fact, a lot of compassion and a lot of understanding, and also themselves, some almost inoculation for some of the suffering that life offers. I think as parents, we're so obsessed with protecting our children, and I'm not sure that that's a service to them. I think if we can kind of help them understand, the full range of emotions and how things can go south and how they can watch us become resilient, I think, hopefully that's a great lesson for them.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What do you say to people when they tell you they're suffering profoundly from breakup now, knowing what you know?
Read my book. It's a lot in there.
Yeah.
I try to listen. I can't be an authentic friend, to people I don't know who are sometimes sharing their stories with me, but I would encourage them to find authentic listeners for them. And also, don't even converse with me necessarily, but tell your story to a tree. I honestly believe that, have an authentic connection with something beautiful, have an authentic connection to nature, have an authentic connection to other people in your lives. Those are the things that are going to help.
I have I have a couple of thoughts from that. And the first is, have people been telling you a lot of stories? Are you getting all kinds of stories?
I'm getting a lot of emails.
I bet. Yeah. That's always so interesting.
It's very interesting. Yeah. How do you respond to that?
I don't know. To getting all those emails about people's own personal experiences. I feel, your book has more useful information. There's nothing prescriptive about anything I've ever written. I'm more of a describer of despair. And so I'm not sure I don't really have any useful ideas for anyone ever. But, I'm happy to hear their stories and to listen. But also you brought up this idea of, going out and telling your troubles to a tree or going out. Can you just talk a little bit? We did not touch on the idea of awe over this hour conversation, but I know I feel like it's really the most important idea in this book. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Early on, I had a conversation with a researcher who said, from a health perspective, it kind of sucks to be divorced. Higher risk of early death, higher risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all these things. But the people that we find are the most resilient are the ones, and here's where she said something I had never heard before. She said, the most resilient people are the ones who can appreciate and engage with beauty. And I was like, wow, okay, antidote to heartbreak is beauty. That is something I can do. That is something I am desperate to try to do. And that is something I can share with other people.
Well, and it's fascinating how it just builds on what you did in your last book.
Yeah.
Like this level of engagement you're urging people toward, this putting down your guard and being in nature and being open to it without any mediation is something that then comes back to sort of, it's bread upon the waters. It comes back to serve you in your heartbreak.
I was very primed for that message, but
right.
I believe it.
Somebody asks about when there's somebody else involved in the breakup, perseveration and obsession about the other woman or other person is one of the most difficult aspects of a breakup. How did you kind of create your own personal transcendence and discipline, not to sort of obsess about other people?
Yeah, not just perseveration about another person, just perseveration about everything.
That's what I was going to say is rumination is the villain of this book.
Yeah. And for me, a lot of it was like, what did I do wrong? Like, how have I screwed up? What are my flaws? It's like we internalize and we take on, I think, a lot of that. And again, that's sort of perspective taking, right? It's just the best thing you can do. And for me, nature and beauty, again, and I go into the science of this in the book, the ways in which experiencing awe and beauty can actually dramatically shift your perspective.
Right. There's this way, I think, especially for kind of thinky people, that you want to, you become obsessive, but you think you're just thinking about the problem. And really what you're doing is making the focus of the whole world collapsing on yourself.
Yeah.
And you talk in the book about people who are in and I may be getting various studies mixed up, but people who are in an experience of awe have a sense of their physical size being a little bit smaller, not of having less of a sense of stature, but their importance is actually smaller. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the same thing happens really, in a psychedelic trip too, where you feel like you're this one small molecule in the universe, and you're surrounded by lots of other beautiful molecules, and you can't tell which molecule is you and which molecule is someone else. It all sounds really hokey, to talk about it. But that is kind of the definition almost of an awe experience. It is
right,
that
non-duality. I mean,
yeah. And it is that there is this larger world that you're just a little part of that is actually very, very, very good for our mental health.
That seems like a perfect place to stop. I feel like the book is so, it's really hard to write a book that moves from heartbreak into some kind of truly authentic and felt positive outcome, which you do. I mean, you're so vulnerable here and you open up so much. And because of that, we are with you as you start to, become a consumer of different modalities and eventually figure out what works for you. And it was very hopeful and inspiring book in that way, which was, I wasn't quite ready for how much of an uplift it gave me. So thank you.
Good.
Yeah, it really did. Yeah.
What a hopeful and inspiring and uplifting conversation this was for everyone watching tonight.
Yeah.
And I'd love to put in a plug, just if you're out there, to support your independent booksellers like Harvard Bookstore. They work so hard during these times to bring these events into our homes. And we're just really grateful for all that you do. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Florence and to Claire, and particularly for your really kind and warm words about the bookstore. And thank you to everyone out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about and purchase Florence's book at harvard.com or via the link that I put in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, hope you all have a great night. Keep reading and please be well.
Thank you. Bye, Florence.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.